The Bible says that everyone knows that God created because of what He created.
Atheists say there's no evidence of this. So who's right? God's amazing design, today on Creation Magazine Live.
Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. I'm Richard Fangrad.
And I'm Calvin Smith.
Today on Creation Magazine Live, we're going to talk about amazing design that we see all around us. Romans, in the first chapter of Romans, very famous verse 20, says that everyone knows that there's a God, that there's a creator, because of the design in His creation.
That's right. Some people profess to be atheists, but actually
Sure.
The Bible reveals there's no one that's a true atheist because everyone knows there's a God. If they say there's no God, they're suppressing that knowledge that God exists because of their unrighteousness. And if you take a look at the human body, for example, just look at our athletes. Look at the design. Look at this flesh we inhabit, this mechanism that houses us basically. It's obvious that we're designed. It's just a very obvious thing, our hands and what we can do. It's very, very obvious.
Right, yeah. Of course, naturalists say that the equation to get us here is matter plus energy plus time equals life. There's no creator involved.
Right.
There's no
intelligence.
It's just apparent design, you see.
That's right.
There's not real design, it just looks designed.
Even famous atheist Richard Dawkins, of course, he said this: biology is the study of complicated things that have given the appearance that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So he's saying, well, we're not really designed. We look designed, but we're not designed.
Yeah, so Dawkins, it's interesting, he calls it the appearance of design.
Right.
He can see what Romans 1:20 says is plainly there for everyone to see,
Right.
but he's trying to explain it away.
Exactly. And of course, we've had examples. If you want to know why this isn't true, we've had a couple of Creation Magazine live shows.
We did past shows on that.
Yeah.
If you look at season 1, episodes 3 and 4 of Creation
Right.
Magazine Live, you can watch that on creation.com, or season 2 if you look at show 2, actually.
Right. We go into the specifics of why these evolutionary mechanisms don't actually
Yeah,
work.
a lot more details there.
As a matter of fact, now evolutionists are actually saying that there's evidence of bad design. This is unintelligent design, right?
Yes,
We've got
we
all
hear
these
that, yeah.
these defects in our, got weak backs, and a designer wouldn't have designed our backs that way, or our wisdom teeth don't fit. So this is evidence that we haven't been designed because it's bad design.
Right. Of course, that's a terrible argument against design.
Right.
If you look at two different designs of tanks, for example,
World War II.
World War II tanks. You've got the Panther, the Panzer tank there, and the Sherman tank. Well, the Panther was a much better design than the Sherman, but that doesn't mean that one of the tanks wasn't designed.
Right. I would have much rather been in the Panther if I had a choice than the Sherman. But yeah, no one's saying, well, the Sherman therefore was not designed because perhaps it hadn't been designed as optimally as it could.
So it's a terrible argument against design.
That's right. Really what this argument is it's an argument against the designer, and really it ignores the history of the Bible. That's the problem. Many people will say, well, we need to promote intelligent design, but that actually fails in a certain capacity, because without the true history of the Bible, the fact that God created a perfect world and is degenerated since then because of sin and death entering into the creation, without that history, it's hard to know why. Why do we see evidence of design and beauty in this world, but also the bad things?
Right.
Genesis is incredibly important.
Yes, to some extent we can explain bad design because we live in a sin-cursed world. We've seen 6,000 years of degenerative changes.
Exactly.
Now, there have been many brilliant design advocates in the past, like
Right.
Plato, Aristotle, Sir Isaac Newton, William Paley, and the list goes on and on and on.
Right.
I mean, many of the great scientists of the past, they were creationists. They obviously
Right.
saw the evidence for design.
We hear this all the time from people saying, oh, well, you creationists, no true scientist could be a creationist, et
Yes,
cetera,
yes.
et cetera. But if you look at what the whole scientific foundation in the Western world was based on, look at the list of people that were creationists, that believed in God and that were just brilliant scientists, that really doesn't work at all.
Right. Now, some would argue that the concept of design, that's just a religious argument.
Right. No real science behind it. But you think about it. Let's say some scientists went into a cave and they found like a circle of stones and some charred wood in there, and they found some pointy rocks,
Okay.
looked like arrowheads, and maybe some some stuff on the wall. I mean, what would they conclude because of the evidence that they saw? They'd conclude perhaps that
That intelligent humanoids were in the cave, something like that.
right.
Yeah.
Well, they can make that conclusion based on the intelligent design that they see.
Sure.
So it's not that the evolutionists and atheists don't want to admit design. They just don't want to admit the grand designer, a belief in God. Because as soon as they admit there's a God, you're responsible to them. And that's
right.
the whole point of the argument. We'll be back.
In Job 40, in response to Job's questioning of God's wisdom, God sets out his credentials and challenges Job to answer a 77-question creation science exam. He says to Job, "Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." The exam covers the breadth of God's creative power, mentioning the wonders of many animals that we are familiar with, such as the lion, raven, deer, ox and ostrich. Finally, there is Leviathan, a terrifying aquatic creature with an impenetrable hide impervious to harpoons, fearsome teeth, and a back covered in rows of shields. It even has firebrands streaming from its mouth and smoke from its nostrils. Though this may sound mythological to us, Job recognized it as a real creature. Indeed, one candidate from the fossil record is Sarcosuchus, a 12-meter or 40-foot monster with an unusual bulbous cavity at the end of its snout that could conceivably have been used for mixing fire-generating chemicals.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Okay, so obviously most people can recognize evidence for design. Now,
Right.
why is it, you see a lot of this on YouTube comments, that atheists are constantly saying, well, where's the design? Where's the design? Show me design.
Where's the evidence? Well, S.C. Todd in Nature magazine gives a good reason why a lot of evolutionists can't see design. He said, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. Well, guess what? If you're going to load the game that way, you could never find evidence of design in anything.
You're never going to get there.
Really what it comes down to is, is the end result of what you're seeing, is it because of the natural properties of whatever the matter or whatever you're looking at? I mean,
Right.
if you look at a rock face, that rock face is never going to get eroded by wind and water to turn into some rock faces, for example. So obviously somebody added intelligence to the rock because rock does not contain information for dead presidents.
Yeah, and everybody recognizes that that's information that's been designed, those faces there
That's right.
on Mount Rushmore.
Yep.
In the same way, we recognize that an arrowhead has been designed.
Right.
You see here an arrowhead and another piece of rock. The softer parts of the rock would naturally be eroded more than the harder parts, but in the arrowhead, the cuts go across the soft and hard parts equally.
Right. So it's been designed. Now evolutionists will say, no. There are natural properties in matter that can give design. And in certain examples, you would say, well, they're right. For example, they like to point to crystals and snowflakes, for example. And you
Yes.
look at a snowflake, you go, wow, that looks beautifully designed. But the fact is, there are natural properties in waters that's crystallizing here. It's like it has no. There's no way it couldn't turn out something like this because of the chemical properties, the natural properties they're
water,
there.
yes.
But now we can look at another design. That looks like a snowflake.
It does. It's a doily that my grandmother might have made, or sorry, your grandmother, or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
And it looks like a snowflake, but what you see there, that's not the natural configuration of wool or cotton or silk or whatever it's composed
That is
of.
right. Those things, those natural that matter, could turn out into an infinite number of possibilities, right?
It could spell your name and that kind of thing.
That's right.
Yep.
So really what it comes down to is there's something that appears designed, something that is designed. If something's been designed, what it means is the information in the parts that make it up are greater than, so the end result, the information is greater than the information in the parts that it originated
Right,
from.
yeah.
Right?
Like a computer, if we think of computers, I mean, we're all familiar with computers
Right.
nowadays. Computers are composed of, if we break it down into rocks, the metals that come from rocks,
Right.
some sand, and
Silicon
IC,
chips.
silicon chips,
Yeah.
that kind of thing, and petroleum products, that's
Right.
plastics, and things like that. Well, you can't get a computer by just taking those parts. You need intelligence. You need design to go
Right.
in and make those parts
Yeah,
do
you're
what
not
they're
going to
supposed
take
to do.
rocks and petroleum products and sand and zap it with random energy for 5 billion years
Right.
and have it
Yeah.
turn into a computer, right? We see example of design everywhere, and that's what the Bible says. You can tell by what God created, you know there's a creator.
Right.
And I love using this example of this plant called a bee orchid. And of course, you look at the bee orchid, and there's an obvious reason why it's called a bee orchid. It looks like a bee. It's shaped like a bee. It's got the coloration of a bee.
It's amazing.
It's fuzzy like a bee. You know, bees are kind of fuzzy.
Yeah.
And how these plants reproduce is phenomenal because not only does it look and shaped and colored like a bee, it smells like a bee. It smells like a female bee in heat every now and then, and that's part of the reproductive process here.
So it attracts bees.
That's what it
Wow.
does. If you look at the schematic of this bee, and of course it was a PG show here, so we'll just keep it simple. But these plants have both male and female parts. Okay, so if you look at the schematic of a bee orchid here, you see the bottom part, the labellum, that looks and smells and feels like a female bee, and then you see this thing called the pollinia. It's got the shaft with the seed in it. So when these plants reproduce, what happens is Mr. Bee's flying along one day, and he, goes, nice perfume, and he lands on what he thinks is a female bee, right? But the way he mounts, because when he lands, his head bumps into this pollinia, this shaft, and so this thing goes, and it sticks to his head. It's got glue on it.
Unicorn bee.
Yeah, and so he backs off. He's got this thing stuck to his head. He's going, what's her deal, right? But this thing has this mechanism in it that bends it down. So he's got this bent thing on his head. But guys, one-track mind, he's like, hey, perfume. So he goes and he lands on what he thinks is another female bee. And this thing inserts itself perfectly into the plant. And that's how these plants
Get pollination.
reproduce.
Awesome.
How do you evolve that? How does a plant with no brain know how to shape and make itself smell like a female bee? Incredible evidence for design.
Creation Ministries International staff, many from a wide variety of scientific disciplines, have produced thousands of articles now available in a massive online database. Some of the topics covered include the feasibility of Noah's Ark and evidence for a global flood, scientific arguments that explain observations in astronomy within a young Earth timeframe, recent discoveries that support dinosaurs fitting with biblical history, evidence from biology that shows that the type of change that is observed in living things has absolutely nothing to do with evolution. Got questions? Get answers at creation.com.
All right, in case you've just tuned in, we're talking about design
Right.
and the evidence for design. Now, we recognize design in some cases when the probability of a particular outcome has been tampered with.
Right.
For example, winning the lottery. If we were to, if you play the lottery, if you win the lottery 5 times in a row, something there has been tweaked. The probabilities have been modified, and that should tip us off that something there isn't happening naturally. There's been some design.
It's been rigged.
It's been rigged.
Interesting example in the last Star Trek movie, and for you truckers out there. But in the movie, there's this test that all captains have to take, right? And it's a particularly funny scene. You see, Captain Kirk there, and he goes on, and he's going to take this unwinnable test. It's a test designed that no one can win it.
Right.
And so halfway through the test, everything starts going really well. He starts acting very nonchalant. He's eating an apple. He sits down, and he wins the scenario. And if you remember the scene, the people who've designed the test instantly recognize, wait a sec, something's up here. It's all supposed to be going one way, and then how could this be that it would just turn around
so the
like this?
probabilities have been tampered with in some way.
Exactly.
We can think of the same. If you flip a coin, if you have a coin and you flip the coin 100 times and it comes up heads every single time, you know that somehow it's been modified
right.
that
Because
beyond its natural properties.
Right, because the natural properties, if you took matter, which is the coin, and energy, which is the throw, and you give it, you just kept doing it over and over again, you're going to get 50-50. You're not going to get 100. But
Right.
if you get 100, obviously somebody's jury rigged it. We see the same type of tinkering when we look in the natural properties of things that make up living things, for example. Evolutionists were really excited when they did these, the famous Miller-Urey experiment.
Yes,
where
back in the 50s.
And they were able to create amino acids from this, just some basic compounds, and they zapped it with energy. And so amino acids are important for building proteins. But the problem is, in nearly all these origin of life experiments, the amino acids came out to be an equal mixture of left and right-handed. So it's kind of like the coin.
Yeah.
If you flip it, you get a good balance of
Right.
it. But there's a problem with life. amino acids that come in left and right-handed forms.
Right. Life appears to have been tweaked that only the amino acids are all left-handed, sugars are all right-handed.
Right.
So we look at life, and it appears that the probabilities there have been tweaked, which is an evidence for design.
Right.
Things
Natural.
have been designed. It's not natural.
Natural processes, make left and right-handed. So, there were actually some scientists that were awarded a Nobel Prize. 3 scientists in 2001 won the Nobel Prize because they had a process to deliberately make one type of molecule.
Okay.
Well, obviously, if being able to make only one type of molecule was worthy of a Nobel Prize, obviously that's something that required a lot of intelligent design.
Yeah, more and more now we're seeing from scientists statements that design is obvious in living things.
Right.
For example, D.L. Abel, writing in the International Journal of Molecular Sciences, says to stem the growing swell of intelligent design intrusions, it is imperative that we provide standalone natural process evidence of non-trivial self-organization at the edge of chaos. We must demonstrate on sound scientific grounds the formal compatibilities and naturally occurring physiocodynamic complexity. Did I say that right? It's not a word you use every day. He continues, at the same time, we have spent much of the last century arguing to the lay community that we have proved the current biological paradigm. Unfortunately, he says, very few in the scientific community seem critical of this indiscretion. One would think that if all this evidence is so abundant, it would be quick and easy to falsify the null hypothesis put forward above.
That's right. And then he says science has an obligation to be honest about what the entire body of evidence clearly suggests. We can't just keep endlessly labeling abundant evidence of formal prescription in nature apparent. The fact of purposeful programming at multiple layers gets more apparent with each issue of virtually every molecular biological journal. What's he just admitted?
Amazing. Yeah.
You see amazing design. The fact is we've been telling the public that we've proven the current biological paradigm, which is
right.
evolution, which is not true. We haven't proven it at all. It should be easy to dismiss the concept of design if all the evidence is there to
right.
prove it. He's admitted all of these things. So, just again, shows you that the Bible can be trusted.
In 2008, the BBC produced a controversial documentary on the harmful effects of pedigree dog shows. According to the documentary, many dog breeders are causing dangerous levels of inbreeding. This results in dogs with crippling genetic deformities. One RSPCA vet said, "What I see in front of me is a parade of mutants. It's some freakish, garish beauty pageant." Most of our domestic varieties have numerous problems due to harmful mutations, and the inbreeding involved in maintaining breed purity tends to amplify these defects further. The changes we see in dogs today give no support to evolutionary expectations. After dogs originated from an ancestral wolf-type creature, their genomes have undergone mutational decay. Their genomes have suffered information corruption and loss, but not the creation of new genetic information that evolution needs to be believable as a mechanism for changing microbes into mangoes, mutts, and mankind.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
All right. Now, living things exhibit design because they contain a coded language in the DNA.
Right.
And we've talked about this many times before, and that's an evidence for design, DNA.
Right, because coded systems have always been shown to come from an intelligent mind. Information comes from an intelligent mind.
Right.
And what's interesting, if you want to be an atheist, you actually have to believe that not only did matter create a code system, but think about it, it also had to create a translation device at the same time for that particular code system. I mean, anybody that's listening out there that can understand English today can understand what we say. We're speaking a code, we're transmitting a signal. But, if you're out there and you don't speak English, we're just talking gibberish,
it's
right?
Just sound.
It's just sounds,
no
just noises and stuff like that. So to be an atheist, you actually have to believe matter created an information-coded system plus a translation device for that particular code just to get your belief system off the ground, which is not really sound,
right.
actually.
Yeah. And we've talked in the past on this show and Genesis Unleashed and so on about the complexity of DNA.
Right.
And the complexity of DNA, as scientists continue to study it, it just gets more and more complex all the time. It's incredible.
It really does. I mean, they used to think that DNA was like a linear code,
right.
So, for example, if you you went from one position. Let's say you've got all the DNA letters, right? 4 chemical letters. You spell them out in 3-letter words, codons, and they used to just think that you'd read them, from here to here. Let's say it'd code for something. So let's say something like your hair color, for example. And by the way, you're not going to find this in a biology textbook. This is just for illustrative purposes. And then they'd say, okay, well, but if you go from here to here, maybe that codes for something like your toenail or something like that. Yeah, just as an example. But what they found now is that actually it overlaps. So if you start reading from here to here, it means one thing. But if you start reading from here to here, it means something completely different. With, that's called data compression, right?
Yes.
If you're working in the computer world, that's phenomenally difficult. Now what they found is actually you can read the DNA in the opposite direction, overlapping the other bits of information. So multiple layers of coding. They think even the way it's wrapped up, maybe there's cross-coding going on.
Yes,
It's
the
just
physical way it's wrapped together.
just phenomenal.
It's amazing. And they now know that there are codes within codes in living things. Scientists have determined that 3% of our DNA codes for genes, and they used to think that the remaining 97% was junk DNA. That was popular years ago.
Totally debunked.
And yes, the remaining 97%, it seems, is information that cells need to turn the protein coding portions into a functional living system like a human being.
It's what they call meta information.
Right.
If you're going to bake a cake, right, and you open up your recipe book, it's going to have a list of ingredients. So you got to get some eggs and some flour and all that kind of stuff. But see, on the opposite page, you're going to find meta information. To turn your oven to this temperature. Mix the liquids first. Mix all your, do it in, that's meta information.
Right, to what to do with the physical structures.
That's right. And again, you need to point out that not only do these genes, these proteins have to evolve, but the right meta information for those things would have to evolve simultaneously. I mean, here on the screen I've got a cake, but then I've got the meta information to how to put a motor together. Well, that's not going to fly. You need meta information as the specific parts in the cake. That's the meta information you need. So again, just amazing complexity.
Yes,
right?
and it's even more complex than that.
Right.
Decades ago, it was this one gene, one protein type of thing, and or one enzyme, that kind of thing. But and that seemed very straightforward.
Right.
But however, there's approximately 20 to 25,000 protein coding genes in the human genome used to create between 100,000 and 300,000 distinct proteins.
Right.
So, obviously that doesn't work.
Right. So they're talking about now gene splicing, right? So that's an example where you'd get a piece of information. I've got it just as an analogy here, and what happens is gene splicing is where you take parts. From certain things, and you recombine them to create other bits of information. So in my example here, I've got a string of letters, and gene splicing. You take your scissors and you cut out those parts. Well, see, now I've got functional information.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
But if I take the same stream of letters and I do gene splicing or splice that information out, I can get a completely different bit of information from the exact same database. So incredibly complex things we're seeing in DNA.
Yes.
What are the theological consequences of adding millions of years to Genesis? How does it impact doctrines such as the gospel, sin, the atonement? Refuting compromise is the most powerful biblical and scientific defense of a straightforward view of Genesis. Loaded with scientific support for a recent creation in 6 real days, it demolishes all attempts to twist the biblical text in order to insert millions of years, bringing clarity into an area usually mired in confusion. Must reading for Bible college students and anyone involved in church leadership or teaching. Get your copy at creation.com.
Design has always been a problem for evolutionists. Charles Darwin looked at the peacock and he said this: the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick.
Now,
why would he say that?
right. The reason he'd say that is because it's so obvious that God created. And right, if you want to be an atheist, you want to say there's no God. That's what he's saying. That's so obvious that it's designed. It makes me sick because it's just like God saying, hey, I'm here. You can't ignore me. I created.
Now, unfortunately, for naturalists, creation reveals design at every turn.
Right.
We can look at an example of motion camouflage. This is just phenomenal design, and there's a human, counterpart. Engineers have worked on this. And
Right.
Look at the dragonfly, for example.
People are familiar with camouflage, but
Yes.
motion camouflage from dragonflies is just amazing, because these are the world's fastest insects, right? They can like turn on a dime, literally. It's just phenomenal. They can reach speeds up to 60 miles per hour. And they have motion camouflage is a situation where basically you have to keep a certain perspective, to the prey. So, for example, let's say you're driving along in a car and you look immediately beside you, you see everything rushing past very quickly. But if you look off in the distance where there's a hill there, it basically seems to be motionless.
Right.
Now, if somebody was to be coming towards you in the car, you're going to notice the change in angle unless they position themselves very specifically and travel along with you at the same time. You're not really going to notice them coming towards you. The size is going to get bigger, right, as you come towards you, but you're not going to notice this zigging and zagging.
And this is what the dragonfly is doing to capture its prey.
Not only that, but you got to think this isn't just in a straight line. The flies are doing this and buzzing around, and these dragonflies are doing this, and all the flies notices is, hey, that thing's getting bigger, and then their lunch.
Yeah.
Just phenomenal design, and the level of sophistication that. Like, for example, New Scientist described it this way. They said dragonflies overshadow their enemies in complex maneuvers that military fighter pilots can only dream of. It demands exquisite position, sensing, and control. So they're actually using this in missile applications now, motion camouflage, to try to...
That's incredible. And anybody would look at that and, so there's a military application. It's obviously designed. We're designing missile systems to do this, to mimic what the dragonfly does. It's extremely illogical to say that, okay, well, obviously that's designed. Our engineers are building this system.
Right.
And then look at life, look at what the dragonfly does, and say, well, there's no evidence for design there.
Right. Because if we'd come up with motion camouflage first, which we didn't, right? And then we came up with this, our brilliant scientists, and then we look at the dragonfly and say, hey, these things have it too. Why would you say this isn't designed, and why would you say this is? It's a bias because it's an anti-God position.
And that's the kind of thing that convinced Anthony Flew, a very famous atheist. He died a number of years ago, but he was an atheist. He became a Christian. Very famous, yeah.
Actually, he never accepted Christ.
Oh, he never became a Christian, sorry.
That's right. He just said that, the evidence for, in life, the evidence of design is enough to make him convinced that
he became a
God.
theist.
That's right.
Right.
And that's why he wrote this book, which really drove atheists crazy when he said there is a God. And I mean, he was very famous for arguing. He had debates with famous Christian theists and stuff like that. And though he never accepted Christ, he actually said, I would say the claim concerning the resurrection is more impressive than any of the other religious competition. So great evidence of design and great evidence that Christ is the creator.
That's right.